and speaking of consciousnesses. For example, one type of consciousness that is popular in the New Age movement is the idea that consciousness extends throughout the natural world. Even a stone may have a consciousness of sorts in terms of its own integrity as a stone. The idea about consciousness, this idea, is kind of an updating of paganism and animism in which the whole of nature is seen as having a spiritual dimension, so that stones and rivers and trees and the sun and moon, they all have minds and affect us by force of will and supernatural agency. This understanding of the world, by the way, should not be dismissed too lightly. It's a highly efficient form of theory making, a theory of mind. Thinking of lightning as having a mind of its own, as being an agent that's angry and threatening, is actually a pragmatic and effective way to deal with and relate to a natural phenomenon. It has survival value, which is why the anthropomorphic view of the world has served us well throughout most of the history of our species. Now, related to animism are other notions of supernatural consciousness, spirits, nymphs, gods, and other conceptions of the divine, including those that appear in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and the rest of the organized religions. And there are also various ideas about human consciousness surviving death and continuing on in a disembodied state on earth or in heaven, not to mention the whole range of psychic phenomena that you can see on various cable stations. Further, there are variations on the Gaia hypothesis, in which the earth is seen not only as a living organism, but one possessed of its own spirit and consciousness. It's not my intent to ridicule or dismiss matters of the spirit. Neither do I intend to endorse them here. I only mean to describe them as one approach to consciousness. The parallel can be drawn between the universe of the spirit and the equally ethereal universe of information. Information is not a material thing, but rather, as conceived of by Claude Shannon, it's the quality of negative entropy, that is, of order in the face of chaos. Information systems process data with the effect of increasing the organization and differentiation within a system. And this is a property of all living organisms. It's also a property of advanced technological systems that employ feedback loops, as Norbert Wiener explained in his books on cybernetics. That was a long time ago, but since then we've grown accustomed to the idea that certain types of computer programs can be called artificial intelligence, and we've come to refer to certain technologies as smart. Smart bombs, smart houses, smart clothing, and so on. It's not surprising to learn then that within the relatively new field of cognitive science, cognition is seen as a function of any information system, be it human, computer, or insect. Even the immune system can be described as employing a form of cognition as it goes about its task of differentiating which cells belong and which do not. While cognition is not exactly the same thing as consciousness, the presence of one implies the presence or possibility of the other. Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, famously posed the question of whether artificial cognition constitutes artificial consciousness. And the same question can be directed towards the communal functioning of an ant colony and the autonomic functioning of an organism. In this sense, we can add to the ideas of consciousness as spirit and consciousness as information a third concept of consciousness as life. Life is at once the combination of spirit and flesh, and a process that's fundamentally negentropic, cybernetic, and cognitive. And in particular, consciousness is associated with the organism's observable responses to outside stimuli. If the organism reacts to stimuli, we say it's conscious. Consciousness also tends to be associated with some type of purposeful activity, even if it's the simple movement toward light and away from darkness. The more typical approach, however, is to limit consciousness to those living organisms that have nervous systems. Consciousness thereby becomes localized to one subsystem of the larger system we call an organism, the subsystem, the nervous system. Consciousness then can be operationalized and measured in terms of neural activity. Organisms with nervous systems require a minimal level of neural activity in order to keep their autonomic systems going and remain alive. But consciousness is especially associated with a high degree of neural activity, as well as responsiveness, again, to outside stimuli. As neural activity decreases and responsiveness is reduced or seems to disappear, we say that the organism moves from a state of consciousness to a state of unconsciousness. But this introduces an insoluble problem in our understanding of consciousness. If we base our concept of consciousness on responsiveness to outside stimulation, where do we draw the line between consciousness and unconsciousness? At what point do we say that responsiveness has been so reduced as to have crossed over from consciousness into the state of unconsciousness? At what point does unconsciousness cross over from something like dreaming to something more like death? Even if the organism is completely unresponsive, the presence of a nervous system suggests that consciousness could persist internally. We look for answers by measuring neural activity, but measurement holds no answers about cutoff points. Quantification cannot help us answer qualitative questions. And sure, we can operationalize and say that for our purposes, a given level, say 25, is the definition of consciousness, but it would be a mistake, and we should understand it would be a mistake to reify or idealize our operational arbitrary definitions. In truth, it could be argued that wherever there is some level of neural activity, or even wherever there is simply a living being that responds in some way to some kind of stimuli, there is some form of consciousness. And this is no small problem, as the recent controversy concerning Terry Schiavo brought home. As in the case of coma victims, the conceptions of consciousness based on neural activity, on information processing, and on spirit are difficult to separate from one another. It does seem that consciousness is connected to biology, but at the same time it is not biology. The metaphor that's sometimes used, and I find it resonant, is that of fire. Just as wood can serve as the material base of fire without actually being fire, the brain serves as the material base of consciousness, but it's not itself consciousness. I suppose that's why individuals whose minds have lost their fire are called deadwood. The fire metaphor is particularly apt when you consider how the brain is entirely dependent on oxygen, so that a brief interruption causes us to lose consciousness, while a longer interruption snuffs out the flame of life. The fire of consciousness also seems much like the burning bush of Moses, which burns but is not consumed. Perhaps it was actual fire that ignited consciousness, for we often consider the taming of fire to be a defining characteristic of human evolution, the moment when we master technology and also realize the principle of transformation. According to Claude Lévi-Strauss, fire not only represents the transformation of nature into culture, but as such represents our entry into symbolic communication. Sigmund Freud separated consciousness into the conscious and unconscious minds. Unconsciousness in psychoanalysis becomes a kind of alternate state of consciousness, of the sort we associate with dreaming or hypnosis. Put another way, Freud viewed the unconscious as actively engaged in information processing and cognition, and he also looked at it as a biological and neurological phenomenon. For Freud, consciousness was associated with the ego that emerges during the waking state, while the unconscious mind is always lurking in the background and leaking into the foreground in the form of slips of the tongue, neuroses, and such. Viewed from another perspective, though, we can recognize that consciousness encompasses the unconscious as well as the conscious mind.